Let me start with a sentence I want you to hear very clearly. AI will not replace architects, and at the same time, AI will replace architects. Both statements are actually true. The difference only depends entirely on which architect we are talking about. If by architect we mean someone whose primary value is drawing, drafting, documenting, or reproducing details from previous projects, or packaging information for delivery, then yes, a large portion of this role is being automated, compressed, and economically devalued. Not in the future, already. But if by architect we mean someone who designs systems, constructs decision frameworks, negotiates constraints, translates culture into spatial logic, anticipates future conditions, and above all takes responsibility for complex outcomes, then no, AI is not coming for that role. What's it coming for are your habits, your assumptions, and your definition of value. So the real question is not, will AI replace architects? Because this question is a bit shallow. The real question is this: which parts of architectural work are becoming cheap, which ones are becoming expensive, and which parts are being created for the first time? And I'm telling you why I'm asking these questions. Because every major technological shift does three things simultaneously. First, it automates tasks. Second, it raises expectations. Third, it creates new markets. And today we are witnessing something way greater than a software upgrade, because I think it's a huge shift in the economic structure of design intelligence. But before we go further, let me situate myself briefly. I'm Tifa, I'm an Egyptian architect, studied in Turkey my bachelor and my master's degrees for 10 years, and now I'm currently based in Hong Kong as a PhD candidate at PolyU. My work operates at the intersection of architecture, computational design, artificial intelligence, and urban perception. But more importantly, my interest revolves around one question: how does architectural value survive when production becomes abundant? Because that's what is happening. Images are becoming abundant. Options are becoming abundant. Drafts are becoming abundant. So scarcity is kind of disappearing from the early stages of design. And when a scarcity disappears, power moves. Anyway, let me go back to the topic of the video. I'm gonna tell you that this video is not a tutorial, it's not a list of tools that you should know about in AI, it's not a motivational speech at all, but I see it as a roadmap. Or let's think it as a way to understand what's actually changing and why most conversation about AI in architecture are misguided, and how architects can reposition themselves not defensively but strategically. And before we go deeper, I want to make two things very clear from the beginning. First, many people say that AI is just a tool, and sometimes I used to think like that, but after a long reflection, I would say that I will not replace AI with the word tool, or I will not reduce it to the word tool. Like, I know it's a tool, of course, but it can sort of be sold as a new labor class or a new cognitive infrastructure, because sometimes it behaves like an intern in your office, sometimes it works like an expert analyst, sometimes it works or behaves like a factory for first drafts. And if you treat it like just another software, you will misunderstand the scale of the shift. Second thing, I will not tell you to learn everything, because this advice is irresponsible. I believe that the future would belong to the architects who can choose strategically what to learn based on leverage, not curiosity. And as I'm a baby academician, I have to share with you first the structure of this roadmap before we start. We will begin by dismantling the replacement narrative because it's intellectually lazy and strategically harmful. Then we will examine the new stack of architecture, engineering, and construction, not as software, but as an integrated system of models, data, simulation, and feedback. We will also talk about hybrid intelligence, where architectural thinking no longer lives only in your head, but across humans, machines, and workflows. We will also discuss latent space, not as a technical detail, but as a new way of understanding design itself. Design as search, constraint, and selection. We will then move to agentic workflows where architecture becomes less about individual action and more about pipeline design. And we will also confront construction 2.0 where AI is already shaping or reshaping safety, logistics, quality control, and material optimization. And finally, we will redefine the role of the architect, not as a draftsman, not as an image producer, but as a system thinker and designer. At the end, I will give you a concrete 30-day plan, not a theory, not inspiration, but I will try to make it a real repositioning strategy. But before we do any of that, we must deal with the psychological obstacle that blocks most architects from thinking clearly, which is fear. The fear of being replaced, or the fear of becoming irrelevant, or the fear that years of education and practice and identity might suddenly break down. And let me tell you that fear comes from asking the wrong question. Replacement is not how professions disappear. Professions disappear when their core value proposition collapses and when the profession fails to redefine itself. But this is not the case with architecture. Architecture has redefined itself many times before. From master builder to drafter, from drafter to coordinator, from coordinator to design consultant. And now we're just at the age of another redefinition. And I think it's pretty obvious that the architects who survive this transition will not be the ones who resist it. They will be the ones who understand where value is moving. So if you're watching this hoping for reassurance, this is not the video. But if you're watching this to understand how architecture must change and how you must change with it, then this roadmap is for you. Let's now dismantle the replacement myth properly. Now that we have removed the emotional noise, we can talk precisely. The idea that artificial intelligence will replace architects is not just wrong, it's intellectually lazy. Because replacement is not how change happens in real industries. Replacement is a cinematic idea, but in reality, transformation happens through something far more subtle and far more dangerous, which is task unbundling. Because professions do not disappear overnight, they dissolve slowly as their work is broken down into smaller tasks. And those tasks are redistributed between humans, machines, and systems. So let's stop talking about the architect as a single role, because architecture is not a role. Architecture is a bundle of tasks. So let us list them explicitly, okay? Architecture includes research and discovery, programming and requirement translation, concept generation, spatial organization, typological reasoning, code interpretation and compliance, environmental simulation, cost estimation and value engineering, detailing and documentation, coordination with consultants, revisions, managements, construction administration, negotiation with client, authorities, stakeholders, narrative, construction, communication, ethical and legal responsibility, many things actually. So now ask a simple but uncomfortable question. Which of these tasks are repetitive, pattern-based, and low context? Because those are the tasks automation targets first, because AI doesn't understand architecture, but it does something else extremely well, which is the transformation of information. So what the heck of transformation of information? I will tell you. Think about transforming text into summaries, images into classifications, models into schedules, rules into checklists, options into variation, etc. And once a task can be framed as a transformation of information, its first draft becomes vulnerable. And this brings us to the most important shift. AI doesn't eliminate tasks, it eliminates the cost of producing the first draft. And I believe this distinction changed everything. Hear me out. Hear me out, please. The task still exists. The decision still matters. The responsibility is still real. But the economic scarcity of early stage production collapses. And historically, architecture benefited from production scarcity. You know this. Producing of drawing or drafts, whatever, took time. Producing alternatives took effort. Producing simulations required expertise. And that scarcity justified the fees, the timelines, and the professional authority. Today, the scarcity is moving. The first draft of amassing a study or a test fit or a code summary, a precedent analysis, a daylight sketch, a carbon estimate, a client narrative, whatever, is becoming cheap and fast. And when something becomes cheap, the market doesn't relax. The market raises expectations. Clients will not say, oh, great, you did it, now you can relax. No, they will say, why didn't you show this earlier? Why didn't you test more options? Why didn't you anticipate this? Why was this expensive? You can do it in 2 clicks. And this is what we can call expectation inflation. So, if you continue operating with a production era mindset, you will feel under constant pressure. And thus, you will interpret this as replacement. But what is actually happening is not replacement. It's simply repositioning of value. And I think we can now start thinking and try to be precise about what's being automated. And I think we can categorize this into maybe 2 or 3 categories, okay? So, first thing that comes to mind is the low context labor. So, if a task can be performed without deep understanding of the specific site, the specific client, the political and regulatory environment, the cultural context, the downstream consequences, that task is fragile. Someone would tell me, Tifa, give me an example, and I can give you 10. Generic drafting, formatting documents, summarizing anything, regulation extracting, quantities producing, standard diagrams, like not high-level diagrams, or generating generic values. These tasks will not disappear, we should be clear about this again and again, but their margins will collapse. And second thing that can come to your mind, which can be automated, is the template-based labor, which means if your value comes primarily from knowing the template, the template will be automated. Templates are, by definition, pattern repositories. And pattern repositories are ideal training material for machines. And if you want an example, maybe standard details, the copy-paste one, or repetitive layouts, or conventional visualization style, and the list can go on and on. So knowing the template will not be any longer an expertise, but the expertise in this category, I think, would be when to break the template. This might be the real deal. The third thing I could think of is linear labor. Because if your workflow is slow, sequential, and rigid, it will be compressed. And AI loves linear pipelines, which means what used to take weeks now take days, and what used to take days now take hours. But that doesn't mean that your role will be eliminated. It only compresses the time window in which your contribution must matter. Now, let's talk about what doesn't get automated easily, which you would love to hear. The first thing is high context judgment, or in simple terms, judgment that depends on conflicting objectives, incomplete information, political sensitivity, ethical trade-offs, or cultural nuance. All of that remains human-led. Yes, I know, machines can assist, but they don't carry responsibility, okay? Let's remember this, one of the most important lines here. And second thing that cannot get automated easily is constraint design. And I don't mean applying constraints, but designing them. So you may say that this doesn't make any sense, but hear me out. Choosing which constraints matter, which constraints can be violated, and which constraints are non-negotiable, I think this one is going to be one of the most important skills in architecture. Another thing that wouldn't get easily automated is integration and accountability. Because even if AI can generate 50 options, someone must choose one. Someone must sign drawings. Someone must defend decisions. Someone must absorb liability. Because simply, responsibility doesn't scale the way generation does. And this brings us to a dangerous misconception. Many architects say architecture is creative and AI cannot be creative. This statement is comforting and it's wrong. AI can produce novelty. That's not the question. The real question is, can AI produce accountable novelty? Because architecture is not creativity in isolation. Architecture is creativity under constraint. Think of gravity, code, budget, procurement, climate, culture, politics. Needless to say that the difference between a normal sketch and a building is not imagination, it's responsibility. And responsibility can be outsourced to a system that doesn't bear consequences. This is why defending architecture on the basis of creativity is a very, very, very weak strategy. The profession doesn't survive because it's creative. It survives because it's liable. It survives because it translates complexity into buildable reality. But now I will give you an uncomfortable truth. Many architects will use AI to generate faster outputs without upgrading the thinking. Maybe I've seen some already. They will flood the world with images without a structure, concepts without evaluation, options without consequence. And I know it's fun. Sometimes I do this too out of curiosity and as an exercise. But, unfortunately, this will accelerate the commodification of architecture. At the same time, a smaller group of architects, they will use AI to compress exploration time, but they will retain control over some things. For example, constraint design or evaluation logic or verification system. And I believe that these architects will not compete on production, but will compete on decision quality. This leads us to the most important sentence of this chapter. I'm challenging the famous cliche that say, you will not be replaced by AI, you will be replaced by architects who use AI, blah, blah, blah. But my take is different. My take is, you will not be replaced by AI, you will be replaced by architects who design better decision systems, okay? Whether with AI or with another thing. So, here we moved the discourse from being a technology problem into a cognitive one. This will help you, hopefully, make you think of the future of architecture as a post-tool world. Like it's not going to be about learning tools only. I know tools are very important, I teach them as well, but focus on the word only. So what is the big deal then? It's about understanding how value shifts when production becomes abundant. And by the way, we have a free newsletter when we talk in depth about these topics and we offer free resources, share some insights, so feel free to check it out. The link is in the description. Going back, this prepares us for the next step because once production is no longer scarce, the profession must reorganize itself around system, which brings us directly to the next chapter. To understand where architecture is going, we need to stop talking about tools and start talking about stacks. Every serious industry operates on a stack. Software does, finance does, logistics does. Architecture pretends it doesn't. And that's one of its biggest strategic weaknesses. For decades, architectural stack was implicit, fragmented, and linear. And I think it looked something like this. You draw, you model, you document, you send PDFs, you wait, you answer emails, you visit the site, you react. And that stack was built for a world where information moved slowly and production was expensive. And that world no longer exists. What is emerging now is something more than a better software. It's kind of a new architecture of architectural work, or what we can call a system of systems. So let me break this down carefully, layer by layer. And I will start with the first layer, which is the representation. It's no longer singular. Because historically, architecture relied on a narrow set of representations, such as plans, sections, elevation, and later renderings. And many people were actually against this or advocating to find a better alternatives. If I remember correctly, Architecture as a Space for Bruno Zefi, he was talking about a similar argument. And today we can see that actually representation is multimodal because architecture now exists simultaneously as text, images, meshes, point clouds, beam objects, GIS layers, sensor data, simulation outputs, and guess what? AI thrives in this environment because its core capability is translation between representation. You remember when I talked about the transformation of information, right? So text becomes diagrams, images become semantic labels, models become schedules, schedules become risk indicators, and this means representation is no longer just communication. It becomes computation. And once representation becomes computable, architecture becomes programmable. So this is the first layer of the new system. Secondly, build on that, computation would be the baseline, not the exception. That's why, by the way, I kept telling my students to start learning Rhino and Grasshopper, although I know they are tools, because they are the base of computational design. I know they are tools, but they are the start, they are students, And the future is going there. But anyway, let's step back and see computational design. Because till recently, it was treated like a niche skill or a specialty or something experimental. And I think that this era is about to be over soon, because computation will not be longer about form-finding statics, but about logic externalization. And what do I mean by this? I mean, when you build a parametric model, you are not making something complex. You are making your thinking explicit. And explicit thinking is what allows automation to attach itself. Think about the parameters, workflows, etc. Okay? How? Let me clarify more. AI doesn't work well with intuition. And what do I mean by well? I mean well when it comes to real architecture, okay? But AI works freaking well with the structure. So if your workflow is implicit, AI remains superficial, but if your workflow is modular or rule-based and explicit, AI becomes a multiplier. And this is why future-proof architects don't ask, what software should I learn? They ask, where can I formalize decision logic? Again, I'm not an anti-tool guy, I'm teaching tools. Tools are very important. They are your drawing hands, but tools alone are not enough. Architecture is evolving rather than just learning tools and you'll be good, okay? Building on that workflow thing, we can move to layer 3, which is BIM, BIM, BIM. I know people, or many people, hate BIM, but BIM is not going to be a mere drawing tool. And I had a discussion with a friend a few days ago, and the argument was that BIM is not helpful enough or it's kind of overhyped. And I partially agree because BIM, as is commonly practiced now, is underutilized. In many offices, BIM is just geometry with labels or a glorified drafting environment. But BIM's real power is not geometry, it's relationships, adjacency, dependencies, quantities, constraints, performance attributes, but BIM will become the backbone of automation. So think of it like schedules becomes queries, compliance becomes logic, coordination becomes rule checking. You see the transformation logic, right? I'm keeping to say this and this again and again, right? The transformation between things, and if they are connected and related to each other, this is where AI becomes powerful. And once BIM is connected to AI, models will stop being static artifacts and start behaving like live systems. And I think this might be a huge shift, something that Christopher Alexander didn't probably see coming, and this is where actually architecture begin to resemble software engineering as a structure. Another important layer in the new system of systems, or the stack of our profession, would be about simulation. And I'm not talking about it as an end product like now in many practices, but simulation as a continuous process. In the old model, simulation happened late if it happened at all. Energy analysis at the end. Daylight checks after form was fixed. Cost estimation when it was already uncomfortable. In the new stack, simulation is continuous. Every design move exists inside a field of feedback. Think of it like daylight, thermal comfort, carbon impact, structural plausibility, cost sensitivity, circulation efficiency, and AI here would radically lower the friction of simulation by having faster setup, faster interpretation, faster iteration. And honestly, this changed the role of the architect. You are no longer defending a design after the fact, you are navigating a design space while it's being formed. And the fifth layer, inspired by Philip Bernstein in his book Machine Learning, I suggest you check it out, which would be about construction itself. Construction used to be opaque, fragmented, poorly documented, but I think the new stack would have construction reality as data. So instead of having this fragmented, poor documentation, you will have real data, and this actually changes very quickly. Why? Because you have now drones, LiDAR, photogrammetry, computer vision, progress tracking, and so on. And the site now becomes a data producing environment. And reality is being captured, compared, and measured real time. So big time. Design intent can now be tested against construction reality continuously. One good thing is the gap between design and execution will be minimum, and it creates a new opportunity for architects who understand data continuity, because probably whoever controls the truth model controls accountability. Another layer in the stack is being a kind of orchestra. I don't know even how to name it, but it's an important layer. It's not a tool or a set of tools, but it's a capability. Like simply think about coordination, but not the coordinating between different stakeholders, but it means coordinating humans, models, simulations, AI systems, contractors, timelines, constraints, and everything else into a coherent pipeline. And that's the beauty of it. Architecture would eventually stop being a sequence of tasks and becomes an operating system. So what AI can do here is that it can function as a glue, like routing information, triggering processes, summarizing states, flagging anomalies, and maybe this would remind you that the age of AI agents has already started. And that's why we probably will see soon maybe some agentic workflows emergence in architecture. And this is where architectural practice quietly transform from a surface into an infrastructure. Exciting time to live in, really, but I have to mention something about tools here. Some people say, learn BIM and you'll be safe. And I would say no, not totally true. Like, I'll be honest, you have to learn BIM, but alone is not enough. I always say the word alone or only, right? Because BIM as a static skill is not the future. BIM as a programmable, connected, and data-driven system is future-proof in my opinion. And there was a book called Super Users by Randy Deutsch, and the book explores the vital emerging role of the tech-savvy super users in architecture and design. And the author argues they would drive digital innovation, they will redefine the practice, and they will help firms thrive amidst rapid changes such as AI or automations, because they will combine the technical skills with the unique mindsets, with the vision, with the soft skills, and so on. So the key point is that the digital fluency would be the key for success. And I kinda agree, but I would complement it saying that future-proof architects do not just master tools. They master interfaces between systems. So what does that mean? They understand how data flows, decisions propagate, errors amplify, and responsibility concentrates. So the strategic shift is not from CAD to BIM, it's from drawing buildings to running architectural information systems. And once you see this clearly, the next question becomes unavoidable. If intelligence is disrupted across humans and machines, and if architecture now is a system of systems, what is the role of the human architect inside this hybrid intelligence? And that's where we go next. Now we arrive at a turning point. Up to this moment, we have talked about tools, stacks, and systems, but none of that matters unless we answer one question clearly. Where does intelligence actually live now? For most of architectural history, intelligence was assumed to live in the architect's head, like experience, taste, intuition, and judgment. But that model is no longer sufficient. In the world we are entering, intelligence is distributed. It exists across human designers, computational models, simulations, engines, datasets, AI systems, organizational workflows, and so on. This is what I mean by hybrid intelligence. And this shift changes competition fundamentally. Alright, you are no longer competing only with other architects. You are competing with systems that think faster than individuals. Oh my God. Like a mediocre architect with a powerful flow can outperform a brilliant architect with a fragile process. Hear me out again. A mediocre architect with a powerful workflow can outperform a brilliant architect with a fragile process. This might be uncomfortable for some, but it's true, and it's happening actually right now. So the question becomes, what is the human role inside a hybrid intelligence system? The answer is not creativity. The answer is coordination. To understand the coordination I'm talking about, we must first understand how AI participates in design work. And there are three dominant modes: AI as generator, AI as analyst, and AI as operator. So let's start with the most common one, which is AI as a generator. Because in this mode, AI produces something that we use maybe every day: images, layouts, options, text drafts. And unfortunately, this is where most architects stop. The value here is speed and breadth, but the danger is superficiality because, as mentioned before, generation without constraints produces noise. And if this is where your AI usage ends, you are not future-proof, you're just accelerating commodification. The second mode of AI in the architecture usage is the analyst. So AI summarizes briefs, extracts patterns, make precedent analyses, flag inconsistencies, synthesizes large information sets. And this is an important point where cognitive leverage begins, because simply AI compresses thinking time, but compressing thinking time doesn't mean understanding. So it doesn't mean that AI understands what it does totally. If it does something for you, it might hallucinate, it might make mistakes, because this is the nature of AI itself. Anyway, without human judgment, analysis becomes illusionary clarity. We will come back to this later on, but the third mode would be AI as operator. In this mode, AI triggers scripts, organizes files, updates models, generates reports, coordinates between tools, pushes workflows forward. And here, AI becomes part of the operational infrastructure. And this is where productivity scales non-linearly and responsibility becomes critical. And the funny thing is, many of the people who criticize AI in our field, or even the people who use AI, most of them operate in only mode 1, and they believe they are using AI, but they are not actually using the full potential of AI. They are just sampling outputs. But future-proof architects move deliberately toward mode 2 and mode 3, and they do this while redesigning their own role. Someone would ask, so you want AI to think instead of us? Absolutely not. Architects would have new cognitive functions, like we spoke about the shift of value, right? So the functions that architects need to be experts in as well would be, as I mentioned. So constraint design, because AI is excellent at exploring possibilities, but it's weak at deciding which constraint matter. And you can just trust its judgment because, it will change from a chat to another chat window. Because choosing constraints is not technical, it's about the strategies, and these strategies are built on many of the things that we as architects are capable of thinking about, like what is fixed, what is negotiable, what is symbolic, what is political, what is non-negotiable, and so on. The second thing that architects should master is question framing. AI responds to question, but it might not always originate meaningful ones. I wrote this many years ago in my site analysis ebook before AI, as we see now, even emerged. What I was saying to my students is the quality of output is bounded by the quality of the inquiry. And poor questions scale confusion, and precision questions scale insight. Another skill or function that architects should know is evaluation logic, because AI can produce many options. So we will come to a phase where election becomes more important than generation. And evaluation requires metrics, scenarios, trade-offs, reasoning, risk awareness, and then we will see design becomes closer to decision science. And maybe this reminds you of computational design, right? Because it's not only based on relativity, but on decisions. And another function we should focus on is integration, because if you noticed, AI produces fragments, but architecture requires coherence. So someone must integrate spatial logic, structural logic, environmental logic, cultural meaning, and construction reality. And up to now, maybe it will change sooner or later. Who knows what's going to happen in the future? But up till now, integration is not automation friendly, and it's responsibility heavy. And that's why it will need a human as if it continues right now. But this will also lead to us to another function, which is accountability. And I will say it again and again, AI doesn't carry liability. It doesn't stand in meetings. It doesn't face regulators. It doesn't answer any question for consequences. The architect remains the accountable agent. This alone guarantees that the human role doesn't disappear, but it does change. And to operate effectively inside what is named hybrid intelligence, architects must adopt a different mental model, not linear design, but cyclic reasoning, because it's like a cycle of generation, constraint design, and verification. We see that AI excels at generation. No one should deny that. And if you cannot see good generation, probably you cannot use it properly, or you're misusing tools, or you're setting the wrong expectations. But anyway, humans excel at constraint design. So what about verification? Machines can also verify, right? Yes, but still it must be shared and it should be governed by humans. So every future-proof workflow must contain all three. If you skip constraint, you get chaos. If you skip verification, you get false confidence. And maybe some people wouldn't understand me, so I have to give a practical scenario. Imagine you're designing a housing project. Instead of starting with one scheme, you generate a field of possibilities. Then you apply constraints such as daylight, threshold, unit efficiency, cost envelopes, code limits, and so on. Then you verify through simulation, through role checking, through professional judgment. And by doing that, you will not only be designing building, you see yourself, it will be like decision system. And this is the shift I'm talking about. And unfortunately, education is misaligned with this reality. And actually, the future demands the opposite of what is being taught in many schools. And I can make a separate video about that, being an educator myself. So let me know in the comments if you'll be interested in such a topic. And by the way, we are sharing these workflows and more in our future-proof architect community. Link in the description, feel free to check it out. Now, before I move to the next chapter, I want to talk about a paradox. Will AI make architects less important? I personally cannot say that. But what I may argue is that it will make bad architects irrelevant faster and good architects or good thinkers more powerful. Someone would tell me, but bad architects have the same AI. We can produce a lot of generations. Yes, AI gives you more iterations, but only if you know what to do with them and how to deal with them. Because of that, design intelligence will no longer be singular. It will be distributed across systems, and better architects will not be able to handle that. If they can handle this successfully, then they are not bad anymore. So a new question emerged. If design is now navigation through a space of possibilities, what exactly is this space of possibilities? And to answer this, we must talk about latent space. I need you to slow down with me here, because if you understand this chapter, you will stop fearing AI style and you will stop misunderstanding what generative systems are actually doing. The concept we need to talk about is latent space. And you don't need to be a machine learning engineer to understand it, but you do need to understand it conceptually because it changes what design is for you. And what latent space actually means at a very simple level is that it's a generative model that doesn't store images, buildings, or styles. And it stores compressed relationships, patterns of proportions, patterns of adjacency, patterns of material expressions, patterns of typology, composition. All of these patterns are embedded into a high dimensional space. And that space is called latent space. So when you prompt an AI model, you are not asking it to imagine. You are navigating a space of possibilities that has been statistically learned from a massive amounts of data. And this matters because architects have always worked this way. We just pretended we didn't. Think about how you design. You don't invent architecture from nothing, right? You operate inside precedents, typologies, cultural memory, construction logic, spatial habits. That is latent space as well. The difference now is that this space is externalized, navigable, explorable as speed. And design wouldn't be any longer what you can store in your head. So this doesn't reduce architectural intelligence, it just exposes it. And I think that AI is killing the myth of the single idea power that we learn in architecture school. And they romanticize it like you should have one strong concept. But sorry, this methodology will survive this shift because when AI allows you to explore hundreds of options, the value is no longer in having an idea, the value is in searching intelligently. So design becomes defining a space of possibilities, exploring them systematically, and selecting under constraints. And you cannot call this less creative, it's just more explicit. Now let's address the anxiety everyone has but rarely articulates. If AI is trained on existing architecture, won't everything start to look the same? Yes, if you are lazy. Homogeneity is not caused by AI, it's caused by generic constraints. And if your constraints are vague, your outputs will be generic. Do we have to say that the originality doesn't come from randomness? I mean, it's kind of obvious that it comes from specificity. So I think you have already experienced this while your studies or practice. So we need to be specific, right? How then to move away from homogeneity? How to regain the authorial control? And I think this is very critical and important, so hear me out. I think there are some ways that future-proof architects would do to avoid the static flattening. Okay, and there are some strategies, but I just would tell some of that. Like one of them is constraint-driven originality. Like, please stop trying to be original by producing strange forms, as we see on the internet. Be original by designing unusual constraint systems. And what I mean here by constraints, like extreme climate response, social rituals, cultural spatial sequences, construction limitations, adaptive reuse, conditions, material availability, etc. And when constraints are real and specific, outputs become non-generic by necessity. And I think AI here doesn't erase authorship, but it shifts authorship to constrained design. The second strategy also about being specific, which is data-driven locality, because most generative models are trained on global dominant statics. So if you feed them nothing else, you get global sameness. But if you inject them local urban morphology, regional material culture, signages, texture, weathering, pattern of use, anything you can think of, then different lifestyle, etc., you would minimize the distance between global models and local identity. And this is the way where urban perception research becomes architectural power, because perception is data. Now, I'm not flexing because I'm studying that, but anyway, the strategy number 3 is control through pipelines, and this is important. The most dangerous mistake architects make is treating AI output as final form. Future-proof architects treat AI output as intermediate representations. So images becomes massing hypothesis, spatial distributions, atmosphere tests, and then they translate them into geometry, into rules, diagrams, performance, logic. So by doing this, authorship wouldn't be lost. It's just distributed across the pipelines. And hooray, design becomes experimental again. Like, isn't that what we dreamed as architecture students? Like design to be stopping as a linear active expression and becomes a process of experimentation. So you start testing hypotheses, you vary parameters, you observe behavior, you evaluate outcomes, and so on. It's just a pure joy, right? And I think in order to be clear, I have to give a concrete example here. Imagine designing a cultural building. So instead of sketching one idea, defending it emotionally, you define multiple circulation logics, generate volumetric families, test daylight and legibility, evaluate spatial narratives, select based on criteria. So you're not less creative, you are more accountable. And I believe this changes power dynamics. When design becomes search-based, clients gain visibility into process. And this can feel threatening, but it also creates opportunity because the architects who can explain why certain options were rejected, what trade-offs were made, how performance and meaning align, then you would move from a stylist to a strategic advisor. And that's why I'm keeping to tell my students to learn storytelling because it's a very underrated skill in our age. So, to close the chapter, we can say that design will lean more into search and research. So the next question becomes operational. How do you actually run this search on a scale? How do you move from isolated prompts to structured systems that work every time? This requires agentic workflows. Up to now, everything we discussed can still be misunderstood as thinking better. But this chapter is about working differently. Because the real disruption of AI in architecture is not static, but it will be operational. And most architects are still stuck in what I call the prompting mindset. They ask, what prompt should I use? How do I get better image? How do I make the output look more architectural? And this prompting mindset is important, I also teach this, but we should start by here, not stop here, because this is not where the power is. Prompts are the surface layer, but the future would belong to workflows, or more precisely, agentic workflows. So what agentic actually means is not like science fiction, it's not robots. An agent is a system that can receive a goal, decompose it into tasks, use tools, evaluate partial results, and iterate with limited autonomy. Agentic workflows sit between fully manual work and full automation, but still they're going to be human-governed system that scale intelligence. And this is a critical point because architecture will never be automated end-to-end, in my opinion. But large portions of architectural operations will be, at least in the short term. And in order to understand what I mean by this, let's try to be clear about the levels of AI in practice. If we think about level 1 as prompting, you ask, the system responds, you copy, paste, and adjust. This is useful, but shallow. It increases your speed, but it doesn't change the structure. And most people stay here, and that's why most people might be commodified, And it's so dangerous, right? So how can we upgrade to level 2, which is tool chains? So tool chains means that outputs becomes inputs of another thing in a tool chain. So a text to image, then the image go to segmentation, the segmentation go to geometry, the geometry move to BIM, the BIM move to schedules, schedules move to costs move to report. You see, we started from one thing, so you see, it keeps moving with a chain, but governed by you as a human. And by doing this, you're not just generating, you are connecting. And productivity will multiply because thinking is going to become modular. And this is where computational design meets AI. Let's move to level 3, which is the agentic pipelines. And here the architect defines the goals, the constraints, and the evaluation criteria, and the systems run tasks, produce structured outputs, flag issues, log assumptions, and the architect then reviews, adjusts, and decides. And it is not automation replacing architects. We have to be clear about this. But architects designing the machines they work with, which is great, and it's not science fiction. Agents are already doing great jobs in different fields, but it didn't just come to architecture yet, but probably is coming soon. And let me repeat the uncomfortable thing that I have said earlier. In the next decade, average architects with excellent pipelines will outperform brilliant architects with fragile workflows. Because pipelines compound, but talent doesn't. And once a pipeline works, it works every time. And this is why corporate firms win. Not because every architect is brilliant, but because their systems are. And maybe you have seen already that some of the big firms are dealing with AI companies to create inner systems that they use. Even big architectural firms are putting investment into this. They're not waiting for some architectural companies to produce a system for them, which is a warning for you because these big firms probably know what they are doing, right? And I'm going to do a big claim. I'm afraid about it, but I think AI agents will make also small practices compete with bigger ones. Because agents would be powerful teams, huge ones, helping you. So I have to give examples, like concrete examples about what agentic workflows are actually doing. So let me start from architecture students. A simple agentic workflow could ingest site data, generate a structured site analysis, propose multiple concepts directions, evaluate them against certain criteria, produces diagrams and narrative. And I already created a part for this pipeline for my students who purchase site analysis ebook. They get access to my trained custom GPT. And here the student doesn't skip thinking, they just iterate more. What about the practice or the practicing architects? What kind of agentic workflow can help them? An agentic workflow could parse a client brief, extract risks and unknowns, generate program scenarios, test massing, draft a feasibility report, and this and much more can compress weeks into days. For researchers and academics, like there are many videos on YouTube about this stuff actually, so I'm not going to talk about this now, but let me give you a warning here. Agentic systems scale intelligence, but they also scale mistakes. So if your constraints are wrong, your pipeline would produce wrong results faster. And this is why governance matters. And some of my clients, as I work with architectural offices of different scales, ask me how to govern the model, or how can this system work during our day-to-day practice. And the answer is very simple. There is a model called the safe governance model. So S for scope, or what the system is allowed to do. A is for audit, like logs of sources, assumptions, and transformations. F for fail-safes, so human checkpoints, like where decisions cannot pass automatically, etc. And E for evaluations, like you have metrics for quality, risk, and relevance. And without governance, speed becomes dangerous, and it will cost you much more than what would you save by using AI. So to sum up, the competitive unit in architecture is no longer the individual drawing or the single design. It's the workflow. Now we must leave the studio because the next major wave of AI adoption will not start in concept design. It will start where money burns fast, which is the site. Up to this point, everything we discussed could still feel optional, interesting, strategic, but optional. This chapter removes this illusion because the most aggressive adoption of AI in architecture, engineering, and construction will not start in design studios. It will start on construction site. Why? Because that's where money burns. Delays, rework, accident, material waste, logistical inefficiency, these are not abstract problems, they are measurable costs. And wherever costs are measurable, automation can follow. And this is what I mean by construction 2.0. So someone would ask me why construction is the perfect target for AI. And the answer is quite simple. Construction has three characteristics that make it ideal for AI intervention. First, it's information poor but data rich. A lot happens, but very little is structured. Second, it's repetitive but chaotic. Patterns exist, but humans struggle to track them consistently. Third, mistakes are expensive. Even small errors propagate into massive losses. And AI thrives in exactly those conditions. And somebody would tell me, like, but we are architects. Why would we think about all of these construction sites, whatever? Because this is an opportunity. Another opportunity is logistics, because construction delays rarely come from one big failure, right? They come from cumulative misalignments, like materials arrive too early or too late, trades interfere, laid down areas are inefficient, sequencing conflicts emerge, and AI systems can track progress via images and scans or predict schedule drift, optimize delivery timing, simulate sequencing scenarios, or align procurement with real conditions. And this changed the role of architectural coordination. Another one would be quality control and reality comparison. And this is one of the most transformative shifts, because with drones, LiDAR, or other things, the construction reality can be captured continuously. And that data can be compared to BIM intent. Any problem or any discrepancies can be detected early, not months later, not during handover, early, right? And the other thing is, this would reintroduce architects into constructions not as inspectors, but as guardians of design intent, but only if they understand scan to model workflows or semantic classification or issue tracking logic. Otherwise, others will own this role. The other one, which is very important, is the carbon intelligence or material optimization, because in many countries it's no longer optional. AI systems now can optimize cutting patterns, reduce waste, suggest alternative materials, track embodied carbon, support reuse and circular strategies. And regulation is pushing in this direction, like cities, countries, clients are demanding it. And architects who treat material choice as static only will be sidelined. And architects who treat materials as a system would become strategic partners. I know many architects hate height and construction, but here's another uncomfortable truth. If architects remain detached from construction intelligence, they will be pushed farther toward the margins. And if architects engage with constructability, logistic, performance, lifestyle thinking, they would reclaim relevance. And this doesn't mean architects would become contractors. It means architects become integrators. So we have intelligence in design, generation, analysis, workflows, construction reality, and at this point, a deeper question becomes unavoidable. If architecture now is a system that spans ideation, data, construction, and feedback, what exactly is the architect's role? And this would bring us to the redefinition. At this point, the conclusion should already be uncomfortable. If architecture now operates across generative systems, computational models, simulations, agentic workflows, and construction feedback, then the old identity of the architect no longer fits. So let's state it clearly, and please remember it. And think about it and let me know in the comments if you agree or not. The future architect is not a draftsman. The future architect is a system designer. And I don't mean it as a metaphor, but as a functional description. The draftsman model assumes information flows linearly and that intelligence is individual and that drawings are the core value. But none of these assumptions hold anymore. When drawings become output of systems and systems become more important than outputs, the role that focuses only on drawings would collapse dramatically in value. So what a system designer actually designs? A system designer doesn't abandon buildings. They redesign the conditions under which buildings emerge. Specifically, they design decision architectures, like how choices are made, which options are explored, which metrics matter, which trade-offs are acceptable, and which risks are tolerated. And this is invisible work, but it determines everything downstream. Secondly, information flows, like what information moves where, when, and in what form. From brief to concept, from concept to model, from model to site, from site back to design. Friction here creates delay, error, and cost. Third, we spoke about it, constraint design and form the evaluation frameworks, because a system designer doesn't rely on taste alone. They design performance, metrics, scenario, comparison, sensitivity, analysis, risk registers, and this doesn't eliminate intuition, it just gives it teeth. Five is governance and responsibility. I talk about it a lot because when AI is involved, governance matters. Because who verifies the output? Who approves the decisions? Who carries the liability? Where does human judgment intervene? Without governance, systems become dangerous. And I want here to move to an important point. I know it's a bit dense, but I have to try to give the big picture, and I hope by the end of this video you will have it. I want to talk about the domains that every future architect must touch upon. You might not need to master all of them, but you just need to understand them. And number one is information systems, like how models, documents, and data connect. Because architecture would become closer to infrastructure than to isolated authorships. Second thing is constraint engineering, like turning vague intentions into operational rules. And as I said, this is where computation and design in AI meet. Three, the evaluation design, like how success is measured, not just aesthetically, but environmentally, economically, and socially. Four, the cultural and perceptual intelligence, because everybody knows that AI can generate forms, but it's very difficult to generate meaning without guidance by you or by the training. And five is the ethics and accountability, such as bias, responsibility, long-term consequences. And yeah, I had this funny argument when architects hear system designer, they fear the loss of poetry. But I think that fear is misplaced, because poetry doesn't disappear with systems, it disappears without systems. Systems are what allow meaning to survive scale, complexity, and constraint. And most great architects in history were also system designers, such as typological systems, structural systems, modular systems, social systems. The difference now is that systems are explicit, computational, and dynamic. And I think the future architect resembles a conductor more than a sculptor. And we already spoke about what they coordinate, like humans, specialists, machines, models, timelines, constraints, like not to dominate, but to maintain coherence. And once the architect is understood as a system designer, a final question emerges. If this is the role, what exactly do clients pay for? What is the new value proposition? And this is where we go next. Now we arrive at the most practical question of all, because philosophy doesn't keep offices alive. Fees keep offices alive. So if drawings are no longer scarce, and if images are no longer impressive, and if options are no longer expensive to produce, what exactly are clients paying architects for? And this is where many architects become uncomfortable, because it forces a confrontation with the reality. But do you want me to shock you? Clients have never paid for drawings. They tolerated drawings. Clients pay for outcomes. And drawings were simply the medium through which outcomes were delivered. So when this medium loses scarcity, values migrate. Value is moving away from artifacts, let's say this plainly, and deliverables are losing pricing power, like PDF, rendering, static BIM models, option sets without evaluation, all of them, they will not disappear, but they will not justify fees. And I keep saying again and again, these will not disappear, but they will not justify fees. Because value is moving towards reassurance. So you can think about many other value proposition alternatives. One of them is risk reduction, because risk is expensive. Planning risk, compliance risk, cost overrun risk, schedule risk, performance risk, reputation risk. Clients will pay for anyone who can reduce uncertainty before it becomes expensive. And it's about positioning yourself as an architect. And this requires scenario modeling, early testing, explicit assumptions, transparent trade-offs. And AI accelerates this, but only if the architect knows how to frame risk. Another value proposition that you can say is decision acceleration, because time is no longer just money, time is optionality. Client wants to make decision earlier with more confidence and fewer surprises. So architects who can compress the work and produce clarity instead of confusion and structure decision moments become very important. Because speed without structure is chaos, and speed with judgment becomes the real power that people would pay you for. Another value proposition would be the performance intelligence, because performance is no longer optional in like many countries, like energy, carbon, daylight, comfort. All this stuff is going to be tightened by regulations, and clients are more informed right now. So architects who treat performance not as an afterthought, but as integrated into the concept design would become more preferable by a lot of clients. Another value proposition might be the cultural and identity intelligence, because, AI, as I said, can generate images, but it might not understand places on its own. You have to train it. It cannot feel the memory, rituals, social behavior, symbolic meaning, clients. And many clients, many countries, many governments need the cultural specificity or the identity or the narrative, especially in a world flooded with generic visual outputs. And architects who can justify form through cultural logic and style will remain rare. And someone would tell me, okay, but we can train AI to know about all these cultural things. I will stop you here. Like, okay, train it, but who is going to train it? Somebody, a human, should train it, right? So the client can do it. The client can train. The client can train, the client can draw, but many people choose not to do some stuff themselves. They want to delegate because their time should be allocated to other things that would make them more money or whatever, or they just don't want to do it. Another value proposition might be life cycle continuity, because design doesn't end at handover. And architects who are going to use this life cycle intelligence or digital continuity or adaptability or reuse potential would form a long-term partnership maybe. So now let's move to the tough part. What gets commodified in architecture? And let's be honest, what becomes cheap? One, visualizations or repetitive documentation or standard layouts or template details. If your value propositions are built on this, your margins, bye-bye. And what I'm saying is not a moral judgment. I'm not advocating for this. It's just market physics. And to navigate this shift, architects must choose their positioning. Many people, unfortunately, will fail because they refuse to choose. So either you be the design technologist or the super user who master all these tools, and you will have the high leverage, the high demand, and the high learning curve, or the performance strategist, you have the simulation, the carbon, all this stuff, or the intellectual architect who have, cultural systems, the narratives, the meaning making, etc. Although it's like, the last one, to be honest, because of the supply and demand, it might not be the biggest advantage. So you have to blend it with other ones, one of the first two. And anyway, to give you a takeaway, future proofing requires positioning, not just skill accumulation. And let me repeat to you, clients will not pay more because you use AI or you don't use AI. They will pay more because you help them decide better and you get them better outcomes with lower risk. So now we know what is changing, what the new role is, and where value is moving. There is only one thing left, which is action. How does an architect actually reposition in reality, not theory? And this is where we finish. We end this roadmap where most architectural conversations should start, with action or deliberate repositioning. If you have followed this argument carefully, one thing should be clear. You don't future-proof your career by only learning AI. You future-proof your career by changing where you sit in the value chain. So let me give you a concrete, realistic 30-day plan, and this magical plan will work for you whether you are a student, a junior architect, a senior designer, a practice founder, or an academic. Your first task in week 1 is not learning anything new. Your first task is seeing clearly. So write down your current workflow for a real project, not the ideal version, the real one. From the moment information enters your world into the moment something leaves it. So where does time disappear? Where do errors repeat? Where do you wait? Where do you redo work? And where do decisions happen too late? And don't worry, it's not self-criticism, it's just system diagnosis. And most architects cannot improve because they don't know where friction actually lives. And please focus here on logic, not software names. Then sketch down a one-page workflow map. In the second week, don't try to transform everything. Choose one recurring task that appears in almost every project. For example, concept options, early site analysis, program extraction from briefs, regulations, summaries, diagram production, massing, feasibility, coordinating, checklist, whatever. Now, redesign that task as a pipeline, not an action. So, ask yourself, what can be generated? What must be constrained? What must be verified by a human? This is where AI enters as an accelerator. And your goal now is not perfection yet. Your goal is repeatability. And if you reduce time or error by 30 to 50%, you have created leverage. In the third week, we need structure, as speed without a structure is dangerous. And this is what this week is for. Take the pipeline that you have built and ask, what assumption does it make? What constraints does it ignore? And where can it create confident nonsense? Then add explicit constraints, evaluation criteria, verification steps. And this could be maybe simulations, checks, rule-based logic, comparison against benchmarks, structured human review, and so on. And in the week 4, it comes the most part that architects avoid, which is language. So you rewrite how you describe your value in one paragraph. Not what you do, but what you enable. For example, I reduce early stage risk by blah, 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 or I accelerate decision making, or I integrate performance and meaning by blah, 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 or I design a system that blah, blah, blah. And then align your portfolio of works or your conversations or your proposals around that value. And if your language still describes outputs, your position hasn't changed. And if you're afraid to change the positioning of your office, just try it yourself. You don't have to publish it anywhere, or you can make a sub office and try this on, whatever, but try it out. And now I want to end with something more fundamental. A line you must draw for yourself. AI will produce infinite images, infinite options, infinite variations, but this is not architecture. Architecture begins where choice begins. Architecture is not the act of generation. It's the act of commitment under constraint. Someone must decide what matters, what is sacrificed, what risk is acceptable, what meaning is preserved. And remember, responsibility doesn't disappear. So if you leave this roadmap with one sentence, let it be this. When generation becomes infinite, responsibility becomes the authorship. That's the future of architecture, and that future is not smaller, it's sharper. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.